booked this seminar booked in for an hour, so we don't want to lose any of Professor Samaddar's time. So I'm so happy to welcome virtually across the miracle of technology Professor Samaddar. He is a distinguished chair in migration and forced migration studies at the Calcutta Research Group, and he has worked extensively on so many issues, including around justice and rights in the context of conflicts in South Asia, on migration and refugee issues, the theory and practices of dialogue, on nationalism and post-colonial statehood in South Asia, and on new regimes of technological restructuring and labour control. I think if I've counted correctly, he is the author or editor of 17 books, including The Postcolonial Age of Migration, Karl Marx and the Postcolonial Age, and The Politics of Dialogue. We're so lucky to welcome Professor Samaddar today, and he's going to be talking about the city as a Southern question. And we will be hearing from around 30 minutes in a talk, and then people will be able to ask questions. We haven't got the chat open at the moment, but you'll be able to ask questions either in the chat or in person straight after the presentation. So I will mute myself now and introduce the professor. Are you okay to start, Professor Samaddar?
Yes. Should I start?
Yes, please, yes.
Okay. So thank you so much for having me for the discussion, and yes, because of the miracle of technology, we can meet and discuss, and hopefully the discussion will be productive. I have something to explain at the outset. I think I was commenting in an informal mode that when you requested me to speak on migration, I was wondering what to speak. You referred to my book on the postcolonial age of migration, and whatever I had to write or I had to say, I have done that. And impossible to summarize. I mean, one can, but it's not, for me, it's not interesting. The other thing is that something else that I could have done, and possibly that also would have been interesting, and telling of how scholarship has proceeded in the post-colonial countries on migration studies or post-migration studies, is that when I wrote my first book, The Marginal Nation, Transborder Migration from Bangladesh to West Bengal, this was in 1998-99. And I wasn't a specialist on migration. I never thought that I would dedicate so many years to migration studies. And I was actually working on South Asian relations and on Bangladesh, India's neighborhood policy, etc. And as I studied Bangladesh, transborder migration from Bangladesh to West Bengal, that was only part of it. But I got absorbed in it. I started my field work. And as I told you that I'm not an anthropologist by training or an economist by training. I'm not also a lawyer. So if you are a lawyer, if you are studying law, you may land up in court pleading on behalf of the migrants who are detained for entering the country illegally. You may work in the area of asylum law, etc. If you're an economist, again, you have your work cut out. And certainly in those days, if you were an anthropologist. But I was neither of, I wasn't either an anthropologist or belonging to other two disciplines. And therefore, in a way, for me, it was a very exciting period to do something new, reading up literature to which I was not accustomed to, I had not been familiar with. And when the book was published, people thought that this was a new work. And so, but it was a case of serendipity, nothing more. And then I started doing, or I started taking myself a little more seriously, and then the refugees and the state, history of care and power, hospitality of the Indian state, etc., and all other things. Started, we built up a refugee studies or a migration studies group around the theme of partition, victims of partition, forced displacement, border studies, all those things, that are associated. And these belong to a family of concepts or a family of events. And then only around 2015 or 16, I again started thinking how to summarize all the work that I have done and make myself clear as to how far I have proceeded from 98, 99. So that's how the post-colonial age of migration, you know, came to be written about. People often ask me to speak of the book for whatever reason. And I found, as I look back, I find two major absences in the book. And this is the reason why I have picked up the theme of the city. And I shall end my prefatory comments with referring to these two absences. One was that the book came out in 2020 when the pandemic was on, and I realized that public health, the impact of the structure of health management in a city or by the city, the kind of disciplinary mechanisms that are given shape, I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought how the regulatory mechanisms of public health impact the migrants and refugees. But the great, as we call in India, the migrant crisis of 2020 made me realize that this was a very important area which I had not thought of. And therefore, even when I wrote a historical chapter in the book, called, titling, if I'm not wrong, Returning to Histories of Immigration in Late 19th and Early 20th Century, I left the entire question of plague and the influenza epidemic out, how they impacted the migration trends, the policy of the states in providing hospitality to the refugees or migrants. So that is a major absence. I tried to make amend by writing a very short tract, more as a campaign book for human rights groups. It's called A Pandemic and the Politics of Life. It's a very famous feminist publishing house in Delhi called Women Unlimited. And the editor was excited that I was thinking along that line, and she published it. And it has done good in the sense of circulation. The second absence is the whole question of city and the migrants. It's not that I am not referring to the city in the book, but city as a site of migration management, city as a site of controlling the migrants, city as a site of disciplining the stateless people, a city that more and more looks like a camp, and the camp that increasingly, big camps which increasingly take the appearance of city, that urban point of view was something that was missing. So what I did was that from last year, for various reasons, my I started rereading Gramsci, not from the usual, the subaltern point of view or all that is related to Gramsci, common sense and all that. They are there. But I was attracted, and I read again and again the tract that Gramsci wrote before he went to jail in 1926, and it is called, I think, Reflections on the Southern Question or something. I think it's not Reflections, but something else. But it's the title is mainly the Southern Question. Meanwhile, I realized that the migration question has already become kind of a question of the global South. It's not that I am naming it, but conceptually, as well as in the field, migration has become a problem of the South, the problem that emanates from the South, and that it's a problem that relates to the global South. I generally do not use the phrase global South. So much so that if you carefully read the global compacts and the language on which I have a chapter in that book, you will notice that it openly says that the effective management and solution to the refugee question and the migration question, for a safe and secure migration and for global protection of refugees, they need to be aligned with uh, the millennial development goals, so the sustainable development goals. So migration management has become linked to developmental politics, developmental ethos, developmental discourses, etc. So, given the fact that migration has become, quote and unquote, a problem of the South, conceptually, geographically, geopolitically, uh, and historically also, is there then any way to latch on to whatever is happening, think of the question afresh, and see what does it mean when we say that migration has reshaped the global geopolitics as well as the the geography of the world in the sense of population movements. So that is in brief the perspective that led me to return to Gramsci and read Gramsci uh, a number of times. It's a small tract. Now, if you read Gramsci, and I don't have the piece in front of me, but later on you can go back to that. There are 2, 3 interesting angles, and I'm not saying that Gramsci can be exactly copy pasted for today's discussion on cities from a southern perspective. First of all, Gramsci, of course, tells you why you should read the city as a question of the South. It's not that there are no cities in the North, but why should you do so? And in my case, or in our case, those who are studying migration, the reason should be all the more on us to explain. Gramsci says that the Italian unification has happened, but this unification and the outcome of the unification has escaped the south of Italy. Gramsci refers to Naples and says that in one sense, Naples is bigger than Rome. It's larger than Milan, the two other big cities. But yet, Naples remained in some sense an outcast or an outlier or an outlier. Gramsci also says that Naples has small industries, factory units, etc. Yet, Naples will never be treated as Rome, will never be as prosperous as Rome, etc. And Gramsci goes into fascinating details of the peculiar or the unique position of Naples in Italy's political, economic, and spiritual life. I'm not an expert on Naples, even though I've read a few other books on Naples. But what was interesting and what is still interesting when I read Gramsci is that Gramsci flags 3-4 things. One is, of course, who are the workers of Naples? Who are they? Where from do they arrive, etc. Second, the financing of Naples and how Naples is sucked dry by the Republican Italian state based in the north, giving nothing in return to Naples. So Naples is, in that sense, on the periphery of the nation. But Gramsci doesn't stop. Gramsci says that interesting is that given this kind of not backwardness is something that Gramsci uses, but Gramsci is not in the developmental mode of thought. But Gramsci says that given this position of Naples, very paradoxical, you have to think of the religious control and the religious factor in shaping Naples' mentality. So, what is exactly the nature of the influence of the Pope and the papacy over Naples? What kind of pastors? Who are they? And how do people respect the Pope, but yet they respect Pope and they are Catholics, but yet they have a sense of, Gramsci explains that, kind of a mixture of crime, daily life of the workers, unsettled life of the immigrants, and operations of various syndicates, fascinating literature, and at the same time, a theological regime also, which is tied to the Catholic religion. Gramsci, it's an unfinished note, Gramsci writes that this is the Mediterranean, this is Europe on the Mediterranean. This is not only the south of Italy, but this is south of Europe. And Gramsci prepared, I will end with two more comments and then go over to a little more on the city and the migrants. Gramsci says that Italian communists who are based in Milan and many other cities of central Italy as well as northern Italy, they must understand that Naples and cities like Naples, Sardinia, it is not only the kingdom of, the old kingdom of Sicily, which had both Sardinia, Naples, all of them, but the others also, that they are distinct from the north of Italy. And unless the Italian communists had that feel of what it means to belong to the South, does the nation matter to the South? Or if the nation matters to the South, in what way the South thinks of the nation? On the other hand, you could say that in what way the nation thinks of the South. So it is this relation of not only ambiguity, but an absolutely vexed and paradoxical relation that ordains the coexistence of the South and the North in Italy. I was inspired, as you know, Gramsci could not finish that note. He had the note in his pocket, and when the police arrested him, he was going to attend the underground meeting of the Communist Party of Italy, and he was apprehended, never to come out, only a few months before he died. And luckily, the note was saved, and it was published in Italian 3 years or 4 years later, and much later in English. I was so inspired by the kind of uh, the unusual angle that Gramsci had placed or posited in order to study a city. So I started little bit of studies on other southern European cities. First of all, Marseille, the same relation that you find between Naples and Rome, the same relation obtains between Marseille and Paris. And you may find other southern European cities. Classic would be Athens. At one level, it is the capital of the country, but at another level, it is south. It is the south of Europe. And it has enormous similarities of cities on the other side of the Mediterranean. So you may have Cairo, Alexandria, Tunis, Algiers, and all that. Now, if you look at this, please tell me just 5 minutes before I have to stop, I will stop, because one can go on with these things. If you look at the cities of the world today, uh, 13 of the 18 cities, according to the Habitat report of 2019, 12 or 13 are cities of Asia and South America. Only Tokyo, and I'm forgetting, there is one more city that features among the biggest cities, and biggest in terms of population, even though area-wise also. So you have Mexico and Sao Paulo, you have Nairobi, Kinshasa, And then you have Karachi, you have Mumbai, you have Calcutta, Delhi, Bangkok, Jakarta, up to all the way to, I think from China, you have 2 or 3 very big cities. Evidently, the urban question is therefore a southern question. It is a southern question from the angles that Gramsci anticipated, but it is also a southern question in terms of the global urban configuration. If you read Saskia Sassen's Global Cities, now Saskia Sassen's global cities are New York, London, Tokyo. You can see her configuration of the globe. But my configuration is completely different. It's not that Saskia Sassen is not bringing out some truth. She is. She is telling, in fact, some of the very important things in terms of how cities become global, and to point out 3 features that she mentions, among others. So there are global farms with connections with economies of various countries that they enfranchise and delegate, ancillarize their production through different circulation chains and supply chains. But third, which I find is very important in Saskia Sassen's writings, is something that she came up with after formulating the theory of global cities, is her book, what she wrote in her book, if I'm not wrong, called Expulsions. That how part of the urban populations are expelled. The catch is that, and I would like to push Sassen's point, that the city doesn't survive only by expelling. The city survives by also accommodating migrants, not out of philanthropy, not out of choice, but simply that is how cities are made. Uh, an interesting, take on this would be if you read Michel Foucault's, uh, let's say, I think it's 1977 or 78, Collège de France, France lecture series, Security, Territory, Population, where actually Foucault is showing that modern biopower could emerge only when the old towns could become modern cities, and he puts the moment of that great transformation uh, between 16th and 17th centuries. When cities, he says, learns to stand on 3 main planks. One is, which is true even today, and I mentioned, one is that the city is repeatedly ravaged in those days by plague. And Foucault says that when leprosy was the dominant scourge of the European cities, uh, cities or towns survived by expelling the lepers. So you got leper colonies outside the city. Hmm? So if that was the model of rule, you could have migrants who would work in the city during the day, but it's like a day permit, and when the day is over, you go out and remain in migrants' dens and town, etc. Think of the ancient cities or the early medieval cities. And Foucault's argument is that controlling lepers and leprosy is the model. But with the arrival of the bubonic plague and the plagues that ravaged Europe in the Middle Ages, cities have to learn how to internally control the plague-stricken population, because the plague-stricken population cannot be expelled. What do you do with that? And there is this great description of Foucault of medieval towns where uh, controlling and managing, regulating plagues become an essential part of urban administration. That's number one then, that manage the city on the basis of whatever you have learned in terms of stabilizing the population. So therefore, the whole idea is that it is no longer the feature of the city to cut the rebel's head, but fine, but more a feature of the city of saving human lives. And to save human lives, you have to know how to control, how to manage a city's population. So migration becomes a part of population management from, let's say, 18th, but certainly 19th century. Second is the whole question of circulation of goods, of capital and labor. Again, migrants come in a very big way. And third is, of course, what Foucault says, that warehouses, supply depots, and architecture. And again, if you look into the whole question of architecture, and I will end with that, that the city, the southern city today represents what you may call the fractured geography of the urban. So you have in the city not a standardized architecture. It's not enough to say that the city would have roads, streets, lanes, by-lanes, public quarters, public gardens, administrative quarters, business districts. You can go on and on. But it's also important to say where the migrants will be quartered. Where will be the slums? Where will be what we call the inner city? Where will be the stateless people? Most importantly, where will be the sex workers' place? Because there is no city without a university and a place for sex work. No city. The city always starts with two foundations. One is that there is, in some way, educational institutions. And second is, from the beginning, there will be some scope of sex work, and therefore sex workers who are 90% of the time from the beginning migrants. Now I will end with that. Given all this nature, if we approach the city today as, whether it is in terms of the fractured geography of the city, therefore the redrawing of the internal boundaries within the city, drawing and redrawing, in terms of population management, in terms of capital flows, and in terms of the administration, one can clearly see that the migrant and managing the migrant sits at the heart of the modern urban management. And so this very oft repeated phrase of the figure of the migrant, you can't think of the city without the accompanying figure of the migrant. If all this is so, and if at least these are the reasons why I have been studying city as the southern question, the question of our time, because they are pushing the world urbanization process. The cities of the north are not pushing. Economy, wealth, population-wise, area-wise, logistically, these are the cities, the 20 cities, as I was telling, most of them. What will be the future? And can we think of a desirable urban future without taking into account the question of the migrant squarely? And going back to Gramsci, I think Gramsci didn't anticipate all these things, so we should not labor Gramsci's text with too many expectations. But I do believe that there will be many changes and many shifts in terms of understanding city as a southern question, but certainly Gramsci would be a very good starting point. So thank you.
Thank you so much for such a fascinating and rich talk, Professor Samaddar. I've got a few questions of my own that I'd love to start with one at least to abuse my role of chair, if that's okay. I wanted